Shalom. My name is Yair Davidiy. I'm speaking to you from the land of Israel, from a region in the area of Yehuda, close or by the area, the place where Bethlehem in the biblical time stood. And today we are about to discuss Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a British statesman. He was born in 1874. He died in 1965. He was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945. That is, during the Second World War, he led the British against the Germans. He restored British morale. He epitomized, he embodied the British fighting spirit. When the Britain stood alone, in all the world, Britain stood alone against the Nazi menace and fought against them. Britain led the people. He gave them belief in themselves. He gave voice to their inner instincts that this is what they had to do, and this is what they were, and this is what they were bound to do, and this was their finest hour. This was the time when they gave expression to their inner being. And so this is what Churchill was. Churchill, as a young man, he had been a military correspondent, he'd been an officer, he had fought in wars. He was also a champion sportsman in polo and fencing. He was a writer of history books. He was a researcher. He was a gifted speaker. He knew realms and realms of poetry. He was well versed in literature. And also in science. He kept abreast of developments. He was a person who knew what he was doing, and he made it felt, and he had the beliefs that show that he was the embodiment of Ephraim. We have the 10 tribes of Israel who got lost. So 12 out of the 12 tribes, 10 of them divided, split apart from the Judah, became their own independent kingdom north of Judah. This 10-tribe kingdom was taken away by the Assyrians. It lost consciousness of its ancestry. We have traced them to the west. Amongst the western peoples we find the predominance of Joseph in the British Isles. We identify the English as being also from the lost 10 tribes, and especially from Ephraim. And Ephraim gives expression to itself. And Churchill embodied Ephraim in a sense. Also we have the Maharil of Prague, a recent Jewish thinker, a great rabbi. And he said that amongst the peoples of the world, their inner soul is given expression by the great men who rise amongst them, not so much by the masses of people as we see at an initial glance. So this is worth noting. So Churchill, in effect, was a great person of Ephraim. He was a great person of the British, and he gave expression to the British character. Also, Churchill was a friend of the Jewish people. He's a friend of the Zionist movement. He believed that the Jews should have their own land in the land of Israel, and he consistently worked to further this belief. And so that is what we're about to speak of. Churchill was descended from John Churchill. John Churchill, born in 1650, died in 1722, was a man of humble origins. Not as much is known of who his ancestors were. He had a sister named Arabella. Arabella became the mistress of James Stuart. James Stuart was the future King James II. He was the brother of Charles II at that time. When Arabella became his mistress, and Arabella persuaded James to accept John, apparently John was a younger brother, to accept John into his service as a page, as a kind of messenger boy, attendant. And this is what James did. And so John Churchill became the page, the attendant upon James II, the man who was to become James II. And he grew up in this service. Eventually, since he was not a rich person, he supplemented his employment by being a kind of gigolo, by paying attention to other women, to rich women. He was once caught with the mistress of Charles II. Charles II caught him, and he said unto him, "You are a rascal, but I forgive you because you do it to get your bread." But John Churchill was not an ordinary person. He was not a no good. He had the talents. He wished to become a soldier. He prevailed upon James II to buy a commission for him in the army. That was a practice at that time. And in the army he served. Britain fought wars against the French, against other people at that time, and John Churchill served in these wars, and he consistently gave expression to his bravery, to his courage, and he was promoted again and again and again, eventually leading the army and defeating the forces of Louis XIV of France and becoming the greatest military leader of his age. And in the opinion of some military experts, perhaps of all time, from a simple technical point of view. All events, he did something. He became what he became, and he was not an ordinary person. He was made the Duke of Marlborough. Marlborough, like in Marlborough cigarettes, is the name of a place in Britain, and he is known as the Duke of Marlborough. In history, John Churchill gave rise to a whole dynasty of statesmen, of soldiers, of people who made their mark in history. John Churchill became the founder of a dynasty of statesmen and soldiers. He also received the title the Duke of Marlborough. The Duke of Marlborough, like Marlborough cigarettes. That is where the name comes from, Marlborough, an area in England. And he had statesmen and soldiers who came out of his loins. One of them was Colonel Charles Henry Churchill, 1807 to 1869, who in 1840 was sent to protect the Jews of Damascus in Syria. The Jews of Damascus in Syria had been accused of murdering a Gentile boy. The people who were accusing him, the Christian monks, had actually committed the murder. They were blaming the Jews, as is usual, as happens all the time. They were blaming the Jews for what they themselves did, and the local populace were attacking them, and Jews had been put into prison. All kinds of things had been planned against them and done against them. So the British, who had the policy of intervening on behalf of the Jews, sent Colonel Henry Churchill with a small force to Damascus to intervene and to protect the Jews in that place. And at all events, Colonel Charles Henry Churchill, when he wrote a book later, called Mount Lebanon, in which he proposed that Britain should take over the area, that Britain should help the Jews re-establish themselves in the land of Israel. And this is what he believed in. He was one of the first early Zionists, actually restorationists. Restorationism is a movement in Britain similar to Zionism that wanted to return the Jews to the land of Israel, to help the Jews resettle in the land of Israel and establish their own Jewish state. This is known as restorationism, and it was a strong movement amongst certain classes of the British people and had an important influence historically. And apparently Colonel Charles Henry Churchill was one of the adherents of this movement, of this belief. Later we have Lord Randolph Henry Spencer Churchill, 1849 to 1895. Lord Randolph was the father of Winston Churchill. Lord Randolph was also a prominent statesman and politician. He had many Jewish associates. He also spoke on behalf of the Jews and urged the British to intervene in Russia against anti-Jewish pogroms that were taking place in the 1880s and 1890s. In other words, Lord Randolph was active on behalf of the Jewish people. As far as we know, Winston Churchill himself had no Jewish ancestry. He may have had, but nothing has been proven. Some people say that his mother was an American. She was somewhat darkish, but not overduly so. She was a great beauty. It's been suggested that she comes from a family known as Jacobson, who were Jewish, but this has not been proven, and nothing really is known. And it is also believed that even though her family, in essence, was of Huguenot, that is French descent, French Protestants who had settled in America, they may have also had some Amerindian that is native Indian, Native American admixture, and also perhaps even black Negro admixture. And Churchill himself apparently mentioned this on occasion. He mentioned this possibility. It was not hidden from him. Winston Churchill, as a young man, has had a serious lisp. He had a problem saying the shin. Instead of shin, he would say sin. And we also find this as being a characteristic of Ephraim, where they said symbolizes instead of shibboleth in Judges 12:6. So this is it's interesting. Churchill began his, as we said, Winston Churchill began his life as a soldier and as a war correspondent. He was also a champion swordsman and also a polo player, in a world championship standard. One of the best in the world, amongst the best in the world in this field. So he wasn't a layabout altogether. He was quite active. He also was is said to have had an interest in the red-headed girls. It's not certain, but at all events, when he did get married, he remained faithful to his wife all his life, as far as we know. He also always kept abreast of the latest developments in current thought and political philosophy and historical research and in scientific achievement. And he was an intellect. He learned vast realms and realms of poetry off by heart. He put his mind and heart. He put himself into it. He devoted time and energy into academic studies, to learning things. He learned poetry. He could repeat whole poems, whole books of poetry. And he did this for his own sake, for the sake of the beauty of what he was learning, which is also something. He himself was friendly to the Jews, always liked the Jews. He urged the Jews to be good Jews. He said a good Jew is a good Englishman. He believed that the Jews should be religious, should adhere to their religious practices. And this was his sentiments. Also, he had a grandson, also known as Winston Churchill. He had a lot of children, quite a few children. But amongst his children was Winston Churchill, who's also a correspondent, a war correspondent, and wrote a book on the Six-Day War. And at the beginning of this book, describing the Six-Day War, he mentions the belief that the last 10 tribes went to the British Isles. And he mentions it in such a way that he would... he believes there may be something to it, or it's not to be dismissed altogether. At all events, this is it. Winston Churchill was in love with history. He was an historian. He also liked the French. He spoke French passably well. He spent a lot of his spare time in France. And at the outbreak of the Second World War, he proposed that Britain and France should join together and become one country. Churchill entered Parliament in 1900, but before then, in 1898, he visited France. He was already a well-known person. He was already an accomplished author and an international character, and he came from an important family. In 1898, he visited France. At that time, there was the Dreyfus affair, and Émile Zola, the novelist, was waging a campaign on behalf of Dreyfus. Captain Dreyfus was a French soldier who had been falsely accused of spying for Germany. And this was a false charge, and it had anti-Semitic motivations. They wanted to brand Dreyfus, even though they knew that it was not true, at least at the end of the trial, or perhaps in the beginning of the investigation. There were certain suspicions that led to Dreyfus, but when they had reached the end of their investigation, they must have been aware that Dreyfus was not guilty. But nevertheless, they decided to charge him and to put him on trial for treason, and they punished him. There was a campaign for Dreyfus led by Émile Zola, and Churchill came to France, and he got in contact with Zola, and he attempted to help them in this campaign. He too believed in the innocence of Dreyfus. Eventually Dreyfus was acknowledged to have been falsely accused, and his innocence was acknowledged. As we said, in 1900, Churchill entered the British Parliament. At the time Churchill entered Parliament, in Russia there were pogroms. The crowds of people who had been incited, had been misled, or primitive types. Cruel groups of people have been attacking Jews and doing all kinds of things to them, to their women and their children, and killing them and robbing them, and these were known as pogroms. And there were Jews who wanted to migrate from Russia. They wanted to leave Russia. And there were not many places they could go to at that time, in the 1900s. And many of them wanted to come to Britain where things were better, the conditions were better, they were safer. And they wanted to get to Britain, but there was a prejudice in Britain. The people didn't want too many Jews coming into the country. So that what is known as the proposals, known as the Aliens Bill, to limit the number of immigrants who would be allowed to enter. And these proposals were directed mainly against the Jews, so that was the motivation behind them. And Churchill campaigned and did what he could to prevent these bills from passing, and he did this on behalf of the Jewish people, on behalf of Jewish refugees from pogroms that were going on in Russia. In 1910, Churchill became Home Secretary, that is Minister of the Interior, and in 1911, the next year, there were also attacks in Britain, in Wales actually, of miners and other peoples against Jewish shopkeepers. They weren't serious by international standards, but nevertheless they did take place, and they were offensive and they were damaging to the Jewish people. So Churchill did what he could to punish the offenders and to prevent these events from recurring. In 1914, the First World War began. Churchill enabled Hans Herzl, the son of Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl had established the modern Zionist movement. That was a movement amongst Jewish intellectuals and Jewish people of influence to try and establish a state in what was then known as the area of Palestine for the Jewish people. And Theodor Herzl was the one who gave them, one could say, a modernized superstructure to this movement. And he made it popular amongst secularized and assimilated Jews, as well as amongst religious ones. And Hans Herzl was the son of Theodor Herzl. He'd come to England, and technically, because he was born in Austria, there's a problem with him becoming a British citizen, but Churchill enabled him to do so. Also in Britain at that time, there was a Zionist leader, Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist. He was a leader of the Zionists, and he developed a synthetic substitute for acetone, a chemical that is crucial or vital in the production of gunpowder, which was potentially of great value to the British war enterprise. And Churchill also became a friend of Chaim Weizmann. In 1918, the First World War ended, but meanwhile the Russian Revolution had taken place in 1917. And the Russian Revolution had taken place in 1917, but the people of the previous regime were still fighting. They still wanted to come back, to bring the Tsar back, or to bring back something in place of the revolutionaries. The Russian Revolution took place in 1917. It was a revolution against the Tsar, against oppression. Originally, the leaders of the revolution were not communists. People seem to forget this. The original leaders of the revolution were headed by the first Prime Minister, Kerensky. His father was Jewish. They had amongst a social democratic agenda, and they were pro-Western. They kept Russia in the war against Germany, and so Germany sent Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, into Russia with a trunk case full of gold coins with instructions to take over Russia and to get Russia out of the war. And that's what he did. Lenin came into Russia, took over the country. The Bolsheviks took over the country. And they made peace with Germany, giving Germany giving Germany important territories within Russia itself and rights within Russia. The Brest-Litovsk Agreement, the Bolsheviks took over the country and they proceeded to make peace with Germany, giving Germany far-reaching concessions and lands within Russia itself. And then they proceeded to administer the country, to introduce the communist reforms. But they hadn't conquered it all. They had not taken it all over. There was opposition to them. There was a civil war within Russia. There were the Reds versus the Whites. The Whites and General Denikin wanted to go back to how things were previously, to restore the Tsar or to restore some type of system similar to what it had been previously. And people in the West backed Denikin. They sent forces in. They sent foreign forces into Russia, but they were defeated by Trotsky. And but for a while, this went on. For a few years, it was a backwards and forwards struggle, till ultimately the communists asserted their preeminence within the country. Churchill, who was always against communism, against socialism, naturally backed the so-called white forces under Denikin, but he was dismayed when he saw that these forces also attacked Jews. They instigated pogroms against Jews, and he attempted to mitigate this, to urge them to restrain themselves. Unfortunately, he was not very successful in this endeavour. In the Ukraine, in the period 1918 to 1920, more than 60,000 Jews were killed, many more were injured or raped or suffered grievously. Most of the culprits, the perpetrators, were the forces of the White Russians under Denikin. So this should be remembered. This happened. People forget about it because shortly afterwards greater tragedies took place. But at the time it was important, and it is important from a historical point of view. The forces of Denikin were subject to a heavy, systematic anti-Jewish propaganda, especially in the form of the so-called protocols. The protocols were like a book describing an alleged plot by Jews to take over the world. They had originated in Germany, as we shall describe shortly. They had originated in Germany, but they had spread all over, and they had been promoted by Henry Ford in the USA, who had his own newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, that promoted and spread the protocols throughout the USA. Later on, Henry Ford was to go on and to be a financial backer and a mentor, one could say, of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler greatly admired Henry Ford, in his own words. What are the protocols, the so-called protocols of Zion? This is a book, a document that purports to describe a plot by the Jews and the Freemasons to undermine civilization and undermine society and to take over the world. Describes meetings that took place and discussions that were held and the decisions that were reached. These are the so-called protocols. They seem a bit childish, but nevertheless they exist and people believe that they were genuine. How did they originate? So there were writers of satire or political commentators using satire described the situation in France, in Germany. People writing satirical works described the operations of secret societies that did exist in Germany and in France, and their machinations and their plots, and they were openly fictitious. But they were supposed to be a commentary on the existing political situation. At all events, this type of genre has become a kind of genre, a type of literary output. It evolved into it began to take an anti-Semitic basis. Jews were also inserted. Originally Jews were not in the equation, but someone started putting the Jews in as being part of the plotters. And then the Prussian Secret Service produced the protocols as we now know, ascribing the bulk of the blame for the secret plotting by people trying to take over society, trying to destroy civilization for their own aggrandizement, ascribing the sinister element as being attributable to the Jews. This is the Prussian, what now is German Secret Service produced, and put it out as if it was a document that the Jews had written. And some people believed it to be true. They also spread it to Russia, whereas too the Russian Secret Service also began to spread this document, and spread, and became popular. At that time there were numerous upheavals, there were revolutions, all kinds of revolutionary movements, and people of wealth or position were terrified for their situations. Nothing was certain. Society seemed to be collapsing, and people thought they were seeing before their eyes in the regular revolutions and counter-revolutions and all the troubles that were going on, they were seeing the result of the protocols put into action. For them it was proof, and the protocols were believed at the beginning. Even in Britain there were some people who believed in them. At one stage the Times newspaper, which is a reliable newspaper, seemed to suggest in some of its articles and editorials that the protocols might have something to them. Also in Russia, the British Secret Service, as well as the Russian Secret Service, used the protocols to smear the Bolsheviks and to strengthen the white forces who were fighting against the red forces, as if to say, to strengthen the forces under Denikin and their popular appeal. People hated Jews, show the people that the other side was backed by the Jews, was furthering a Jewish agenda, were puppets of the Jews, and you discredit them in the eyes of the populace, because whatever is associated with Jews is automatically anathema to them, and therefore you will increase your support for your own forces who are fighting against the Jewish menace, as if to say, which in effect did not exist. Lucian Wolff in 1921 provided evidence that the protocols were a forgery. Philip Graves of the Times accepted this proof and published, the Times newspaper published refuttals of the protocols shortly afterwards. Winston Churchill, in a speech in 1920, described the Bolshevist communism as a Jewish movement. And, many of the early leaders of the Bolsheviks were in effect of Jewish origin. They were not religious Jews, they were against religion, but they had ethnically, they were of Jewish origin at the very beginning. Very shortly afterwards, most of the Jews were replaced, disposed of, or relegated to less important functions, and the native Russian communists took over. Nevertheless, at the beginning it did look like the Jews had a preponderant and a disproportionate influence in the early communist movement. Churchill described communism as a Jewish movement, but he was always careful to distinguish between bad Jews and good Jews, to Jews loyal to their countries and to Jewish traditions, and the others. Churchill thought that the best Jews were those who remained faithful to the Judaism. He said that. Churchill is quoted as describing the Jews as the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. He had received a copy of the protocols. He had also apparently been misled by Nestor Webster, who was also considered a conspiracy expert. And for a very short period, he may have been misled along these lines, but he disallowed this shortly afterwards. He denied having said anything against the Jews, and he threatened to sue anyone who said otherwise. Also, his actions and his speeches and throughout his life held up to this. He did not intend to hurt the Jews, and he went out of his way not to do so. Mr. Helen Webster, born in 1876, died in 1960. In 1920, wrote a book called The Jewish Peril. It was based on the Protocols. Churchill is alleged to have quoted from it in one speech that he gave, and in an article that an assistant of his wrote, but Churchill denied this shortly afterwards, and as we said, he threatened to sue anyone who said differently. Nesta Webster herself may well have been misled. She was interested in the occult. We would call her a witch. It says you shall not suffer a witch to live in Exodus 20:18. And the word devil worshippers and Hindu worshippers were active in that time, who had followers amongst the British upper class and the aristocracy. And some of these later became pro-Nazi, and they did harm to the British people and to the Jews as well. We also had Aleister Crowley, who was an open advocate of devil worship and of Satanism. And he too, or his followers too, had pro-Nazi sympathies. Adolf Hitler himself and some of his followers were also students of the occult, of the devil worship, and similar trends of thought. Towards the end of the First World War, in 1917, the British government came out with the Balfour Declaration that declared the intention of Great Britain to establish in Palestine a national homeland for the Jewish people, qualified that nothing should be done to harm the interests of the native inhabitants, that is the Palestinians. A few years later, in 1921, Prime Minister Lloyd George, who was also a supporter of Zionism, he appointed Churchill as Secretary of State for the colonies. In other words, Palestine will become under the administration of Winston Churchill. Meanwhile, under the British rule, Zionist settlement and Zionist enterprises and increased Jews coming into the country had begun to develop in the area, had begun to make themselves felt in the region, had been having an impact, and this had been caused Arab uppress. The Muslims were against Jews coming in, they were against the country being developed, and this would cause problems. So British ruled over numerous millions of Muslims in India, and also in North Africa and in Africa and in Malaysia, what is now Malaysia, and all that area. The British ruled over Muslims throughout the British Empire. The British ruled this region with a very few people, with a very scare-bone administration, and they did not want any friction with the forces of Islam, which were always volatile, and there was a feeling that they had to tread carefully. Nevertheless, Churchill went ahead and encouraged increased Jewish settlement in Palestine at that time. In 1921, Churchill visited Palestine. Churchill was accompanied by T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia in the First World War had led the Arabs in their revolt against the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks had been part of the Austrian-German coalition against the West, the Turks alongside them. They had ruled over the Arab areas in Arabia, and the Arabs had revolted against them, and T.E. Lawrence was a British officer who had gone unto the Arabs and led them and directed them and encouraged their revolt, and he'd done so successfully. In this visit of Churchill to Palestine, 1921, T.E. Lawrence accompanied Churchill, and along with others. Lawrence was a personal friend of Churchill. Lawrence was a strong advocate on behalf of Zionism. He was for Zionism, and he actually deprecated the Arabs, and he also urged the Arabs, with whom he had a mutual bonding, he urged them to accept Zionism as bringing an ultimate blessing to all of the area. The area of the mandate was supposed to have included what is now Jordan, then known as Transjordan. But the Jews had attempted to settle in that region, had not been successful, but they hoped to do so in the future. Meanwhile, the Hussein family, the Arab ruling family from Arabia, had been dispossessed from Iraq, and the British felt that they had not dealt properly with them, and they wanted to encourage them and to settle them and raise them up as a force in the Arab world. So Churchill divided the area of Transjordan from Palestine, and he gave it to the Hussein family. This was probably an historical mistake, one of some of those for which Churchill must take part of the blame. He was not perfect, and he was not just in everything that he did. He in effect curated Jordan as an independent nation, and he placed the Hussein family over it. According to the Bible, that region and a lot more should belong to the Israelite nations. See Joshua 1:4. The Israelite possessions reach up to the Euphrates, at least. At all events, Churchill on the whole was always in favour of the Jews. He was against giving the Palestinians any representative rights at that stage, because the Jewish populace were still a minority and had not increased sufficiently, and he was afraid if he would give the rights to the Palestinians, that they would use their political clout to discriminate against the Jews, as indeed they would have done. At all events, in the period 1922 to 1939, under British rule, the Jewish population increased by 400,000 people. New Jews who came to the region numbered 400,000. The Arab population also more than doubled during that era, due to Arabs coming in from outside, from Syria, from Jordan, from all over into Palestine. Not only Arabs, but Muslims also came in, Muslims from other areas such as Bosnia, Afghanistan. Arabs from numerous places came into Israel. John Peters, from time immemorial, the Origins of the Arab-Jewish Conflict over Palestine, 1984, describes this phenomenon in great detail, and she attributes it to British encouragement. She claims, or seems to claim, that there were British elements in the British administration who were against Zionism and were encouraging Muslims and Arabs to come into the country in order to counter the Jewish presence. They were bringing Arabs to work against the Jews. That is what Peters claimed, and there may have been individuals present who indeed were of that line of thought. But it is not entirely correct. It's something of an exaggeration in our opinion, because not only British but also Jewish capitalists and also even Jewish Zionist enterprises were pleased with the Arab influx of labour and utilised it for their own purposes. The High Commissioner for Palestine 1920 to 1925 was Sir Herbert Samuel. He was Jewish. He was in favour of Zionism, but he was also trying to be fair towards the Arabs. And he suggested to Churchill that the influx of Jews be limited according to the economic capability of the country to absorb them. And Churchill at first accepted this recommendation. Nevertheless, Churchill, in his speeches, in his writings and notes and mementos that he sent out, Churchill always emphasised the fact that Arabs were coming into the country and that the Arab population had greatly increased, and he used this fact to encourage and to justify allowing more and more Jews to enter as well. Churchill was often accused of being in favour of the Jews. He was not an independently wealthy person, Churchill received money from different wealthy people. That was acceptable in that time, in that period. It was a known thing. It was what was done. Everyone did it. And Churchill also received money from wealthy friends of his. Some of these friends were Jewish, but it appears that most were not. Being a friend of Churchill and helping him was a sign of prestige amongst many. There's a story that much later Churchill was in France. He was at a casino. He lost a lot of money, a goodly sum at least, and he requested that he be allowed to sign a cheque as payment for his losses. The owner of the casino agreed, took the cheque, put it in a frame and hang it on his wall. It was more worth his while to show people that Churchill had been a customer of his, had owed him money, than to actually cash the money itself. In 1931, Churchill wrote an article titled Moses. In this article, he affirmed his belief in the historicity of Moses, that Moses was a real person that had existed. He also declared his belief in the Bible. In 1961, much later, after the State of Israel had been declared, the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was visiting in England, and Churchill gave him a signed copy of this article, Moses. Meanwhile, in 1932, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. The Nazis took over in Germany. In that same year, Churchill was in Germany. He did not hold office at that time. He was in Germany because he was researching material for a book about his ancestor, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, who had campaigned in France and the area of France and Germany. And Churchill was an historian. He wrote books, historical works, and John Churchill had been one of his ancestors, the Duke of Marlborough. He'd been a famous warrior, a famous leader of the British forces in his time. Churchill wrote an important book about him, and so Churchill was researching the background for this work. He was in Germany, and it was arranged that Churchill should meet up with Hitler. At the last minute, the meeting was cancelled. It was called off because apparently Churchill, in the meantime, had made remarks that were critical of the attitude of Hitler towards the Jews. Not long after that, Churchill in the House of Commons, the British Parliament, he warned against the danger of Germany, and from then on he became the leader of British opposition to the Nazis. It was not so clear at the time. There were many people in Britain and throughout the world who were for peace, who were appeasers, who did not want trouble, who wanted to get along with Germany as much as possible. Even those who had some type of agreement or not agreement, they sympathy for Germany. It should be remembered that at that time communism was considered a menace, and it was hoped that Germany would be a counter-force to nullify the menace of communism. And so Churchill was taking something of an unpopular position at that very early stage, almost from the very beginning, declaring his opposition to Germany, to the Nazis, and organising opposition to it. The speeches of Churchill against the Nazis, they emphasised the Nazis of the German anti-Jewish practices and their prejudices, and also the danger of Germany to the Western world. It should be noted that Churchill had a personal assistant, Professor Frederick Lindemann. Professor Frederick Lindemann was himself a German, but he lived in Britain, and he advised Churchill on Germanic and scientific matters. He was a scientist, and Churchill felt the need to always keep abreast of scientific developments. In fact, this was one aspect of his lifetime career in which he excelled. He was one of the first people to recommend and to encourage and to promote the development of the tank in World War I. And he was always abreast, he was always up to date with the latest scientific developments. The British, during World War II, were ahead of the Germans in several areas and several fields, including scientific developments such as radar and other fields of development and scientific discovery, which helped the war effort, and Churchill had a hand in this. He was involved in it, and he used the advice and the explanations of Friedrich Lindemann to be able to do this. In 1933, Churchill sent Lindemann to Germany to seek out Jewish scientists and to encourage them to come to Britain. He wanted their brains. He wanted wanted them to come to England and use their talents and their expertise to further the British cause. And so he sent Lindemann into Germany to talk with Jewish scientists who were being dismissed from their jobs and were being persecuted in Germany, and to encourage them to move to Britain. In 1936, the 22-year-old daughter of Churchill, Sarah Churchill, she married Vic Oliver, who was a Jewish, an Austrian Jew. He was older, had been divorced, there were problems. Churchill was not enthusiastic about the marriage, but later he came to accept it. In 1936, there were further Arab riots in Palestine against the Jews, and Churchill at that time suggested limiting, for the time being, Jewish immigration into Palestine. In 1937, Churchill gave evidence to the Palestine Royal Commission, and when given evidence, he said that the British understanding that eventually there should be an independent state in Palestine, which Jews would be the majority. Churchill also said that British policy had been to bring in as many Jews into Palestine as possible. In 1937, this commission recommended the partition of Palestine. Churchill was against it because he thought there was not a sufficient number of Jews in the country to allow partition. It would harm the Jews, but there were Jews who were in favour of it, including Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann at first succeeded in persuading Churchill to vote in favour of partition in the British Parliament, but to ask that more Jews be allowed to enter the country before be put into effect. Churchill agreed to vote along these lines, but at the last minute, Zionism Jabotinsky, the Zionist revisionist leader, met with Churchill and persuaded him to vote against it. In 1938, Germany took over Austria. Churchill called upon the German military leaders to overthrow Hitler. Hitler was naturally antagonized by this proposal, but Churchill did not care. He went ahead and attacked Germany and worked against Germany as much as possible. He also requested at that time that more Jews be allowed to enter Palestine. The leader of the British government, Howard Chamberlain, was against more Jews entering Palestine at that time because he did not want to antagonize the Arabs. Britain was under pressure from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from Egypt, from its Muslim subjects in general, who were affected by Nazi propaganda. The British did not want trouble. They consequently put out the Palestine White Paper, which restricted Jewish immigration into Palestine. Churchill spoke against this paper, against this policy at every opportunity that he had. September 1939, Poland, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. This was the beginning of the Second World War. Churchill at first was made First Lord of the Admiralty. He was in charge of the Navy. He attempted, as being in charge of the Navy, Churchill attempted to have the restriction on Jewish immigration removed, but he was unsuccessful. He also acted to stop British ships from interfering with legal entrance by boat into Palestine of Jewish refugees. Churchill told the British Navy not to interfere. Throughout the war, Churchill attempted to remove the restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. He was only partially successful in doing so. There were also other elements within the British administration who were working against this. And Churchill was constantly opposed in his pro-Jewish efforts by other members of the cabinet and by senior officials. In May 1940, Chamberlain was replaced and Churchill became Prime Minister in his stead. Churchill became the Prime Minister of England. And Churchill, throughout the war, urged that the Palestinian Jews be given arms to defend themselves, and the Jewish units under the Zionist flag be formed in the British Army. This wish was only partially fulfilled after serious delays due to, as we said, other elements being present and having other ideas on this matter. Meanwhile, the Germans conquered Poland, they conquered Holland, Belgium, Denmark, Norway and France. Churchill made a speech to the British people after the evacuation of the British Army from France at Dunkirk. At this stage, Britain was alone. Britain was alone in the whole world at that stage, at that time, against the Nazi menace. They feared invasion of the Germans. Churchill said that Britain would never give in and would take the fight everywhere and in every way possible until victory was gained, no matter how long it would take. This speech and other speeches of Churchill were a turning point. They were one of the factors that enabled the British to ultimately achieve victory in their struggle. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionists, described the speech of Churchill as embodying a rebellious England and as a guarantee for better days. Churchill in one speech said that the Allies' superiority over the Germans was due to the presence of England and in Britain of Jewish scientists who had fled from the Germans. Adolf Eichmann in 1940 wished to embarrass the Jewish government. He sent 3,600 Jewish refugees aboard 3 ships from Romania to Palestine. The British transferred 1,972 of these refugees to another ship named the Patria, and they intended to send them to Mauritius. The Jewish defense organization, the Haganah, they blew the ship up. They intended by blowing the ship up to stall it. The explosion was only supposed to be a small one. It was supposed to damage the ship and cause it to remain at anchorage where it was. However, something went wrong and 267 people were killed. Churchill insisted that all the remaining refugees be allowed to stay in Palestine. Other Jewish refugees who arrived illegally were either allowed also to remain in Palestine or they were sent to Mauritius and later to Cyprus. In 1942, the Germans under Rommel seemed likely to overrun the Allies and conquer Egypt and Palestine. So the British therefore created a Palestinian regiment in which 3/4 were Jewish and 1/4 Arab. Eventually Rommel, the German Rommel, was defeated by British forces, including Australians and New Zealanders. Churchill suggested that Jews be allowed a self-government in Palestine and that the Jews also receive the Italian colonies of Eritrea and also Tripolitania, which is now part of present-day Libya. He suggested these areas also be given to the Jews to rule over. During 1942, reports of massacres of Jewish civilians in Europe grew in intensity. The news of the Holocaust was coming through. The British government attempted to evacuate 29,000 Jewish children and civilians from Southeast Europe through Turkey. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, prevailed upon the Germans to stop the project. Churchill warned the Nazis with retribution. Churchill wished to make these warnings as emphatic as possible, but he was told the result was liable to be counterproductive. But instead of warning, or instead of causing the Germans to lessen their persecution of the Jews, it was liable to intensify it, and also that other peoples who were anti-Jewish or had prejudices against Zionism or for whatsoever other reasons would take actions on behalf of the Jews as detrimental and cause them to be more pro-German. In 1943, the Spanish closed the border between Spain and France to Jews who were fleeing from the Nazis. And they considered turning back the Jews in the area to the Germans. Should explain the background. Before the Second World War, there had been a civil war in Spain between communist socialist elements and Franco, who led a clerical Roman Catholic neo-Nazi type movement, and eventually with the help of Mussolini and of Hitler, he was successful, and so Franco became the dictator of Spain. When war broke out, Spain remained neutral. It did not join the Germans and the Italians, even though it was pressured to do so, and there were elements who were within the Spanish government who were in favour of joining the war on the German side, and they did send a large contingent to the Eastern Front to fight against the Russians alongside the Germans. Nevertheless, as far officially they were neutral, and as far as the West were concerned, they were not a party to the fray. And they had been allowing Jews to come into their country, Jews who could make their way across the Pyrenees mountains separating France from Spain, were fleeing, going into Spain and taking a refuge there. So in 1943, the Spanish, for some reason or other, had decided, or on the verge of deciding, to send all of the Jewish refugees in Spain back across the border into France, which was occupied by the Germans, and also closing the border so that no more Jewish refugees could come in. Churchill sent the Spanish government a threat saying, in effect, that if they take such measures, he would be obliged to invade Spain, and this was enough for the Spanish government to have second thoughts and not to go ahead with its anti-Jewish steps that it had intended to take. The son of Churchill, Randolph Churchill, was a British commando. He went into Yugoslavia, made contact with elements fighting in the underground against the Germans, and also he met up with Jews from Palestine who were doing the same thing, and he made friends, and he was associated with them. From March 1944, any Jew who could get to Turkey through Romania, through that area, through the Balkans, any Jew who could get to Turkey was sent automatically on into Palestine by British officials, regardless of whether he had any certificate of admission or whether he filled the quota of Jews being allowed to come into the country or not. They were sent straight through into Palestine to safety. It should also be remembered that the Turkish government, was pro-German and had intended at the beginning of the war to take steps against its Jewish population, but the USA had prevented it from doing so, but Turkey was anti-Jewish. And so this too was a factor in the forces at work. Churchill later described the Holocaust as probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the history. As probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. That is how Churchill described the Holocaust. Probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. At the end of the war, President Roosevelt of the USA met up with Ibn Saud of Arabia. After this meeting, Roosevelt appeared to have adopted a pro-Arab position against the Jews in Palestine, but Churchill tried to prevail upon Ibn Saud to change his mind and to accept the Jewish presence. Shortly afterwards, Churchill lost the elections, and the Labour Party under Clement Attlee came to power. The new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, and his Foreign Minister was Ernest Bevin. Ernest Bevin had once been pro-Jewish, had been pro-Zionist, but upon coming to power he changed his mind, a change of heart, and began to take steps against the Zionists. And there was a struggle. The Jews, or a portion of the Jews in Palestine, under the Jewish underground organisations, such as the Haganah, the the Haganah, the Irgun, the Lehi, they worked against the British. Eventually the British decided to leave the country, and they did in 1948. This was followed by the War of Independence, which resulted in the establishment of the State of Israel. The forces against the Jews in the 1948 war included those under British officers from Jordan. Now, Churchill protested against the presence of British personnel in these forces, and his protests had some influence in a portion of the said people not participating in the actual battle. In 1951, Churchill again became Prime Minister of Britain. While he was Prime Minister, he rebuked a claim by Iraq that Israel be forced to give up the Negev. He said that Israel should keep that region, and he also refused to send troops to help Jordan against Israel when these troops were requested, even though he did later warn Israel that Britain had some obligations towards Jordan and that Israel should not be too aggressive towards her. At all events, Churchill was pro-Jewish, he was pro-Zionist, and he emphasized that. He told people, government officials going to the area to examine the situation, that he was pro-Zionist and he wanted decisions along those lines. He announced that, he impressed this fact upon his officials, and he also publicly announced it at a press conference that he gave on the subject. In 1956, when the Israelis invaded the Sinai Peninsula, assisted by the French and by the British, Churchill said that if he was a younger man, he himself would volunteer to go and fight alongside the Israelis, and that he wished them well. And he would have done so based on his past history. That is the kind of thing he would have done in his youth, and he said that if he was young at the time, he would do it once again. Churchill was always a friend of the Jewish people. Churchill declared, the Jewish people know well enough that I am their friend. The Jewish people know well enough that I am their friend. And that more or less sums it up. You can tell a man by his friends, and Churchill considered himself a friend of the Jews, and throughout his life, this is the role he played. Thank you, may the Lord God of Israel bless you.